If you're starting on a project, the first thing, the most vital step of the project, is actually coming to the initial agreement about the project. The first component of a project, typically like in construction, is the set of plans. So you have a set of plans, and either you have a general contractor bid them out or you have multiple subcontractors bid them out. So the actual scope of work is super critical to have defined. You want to have a detailed description of the tasks that are to be completed, including the material, the labors, and the specific actions required to complete the task. So if you have a general contractor, you want to have each aspect of the project itemized, specifically the scope of work for each one. If you have a subcontractor and they're doing a very specific part, you want the scope of work that they're addressing to be very specific in their contract. I've seen cases, specifically like construction defect cases, where people have pointed fingers to other people because no one knew who was supposed to do what. It wasn't clearly defined in the scope of work. Things didn't get done and have fallen apart because it wasn't clearly outlined in the contract. If there's any amendments to the scope of work, you want that clearly defined and you want that, signed by both parties. So the first step in any project is having the scope of work clearly defined. The next thing is you want to have a timeline. When you have any sort of construction project, the timeline is super critical. It's costing you money and usually carrying costs to not have stuff done on time. So you want to have a timeline that's realistic. You don't want to say, I want you to do this immediately, and it's not something that can get done immediately. So you want to have very realistic timelines and completion dates somewhat set out and the milestones pre-set out. So that should also be defined in the contract. Another thing that somehow gets looked over is the payment terms and when payments are going to be due, the progress payments. So you want to have a schedule of payments and what milestones need to be met to get said payments, including specifically how the payment is going to be made. It's going to be made by check, it's going to be made by ACH, and then what are the conditions to get final payment. Another thing is the change order process. The change order process is probably one of the most annoying parts of any sort of project, construction project, is the change order. There's different ways of which it can be addressed. There's a lot of sample or template contracts that are used specifically for construction that have change order processes in them. If you have a change order process and it's defined, you want to adhere to the process for each and every change order. It is very difficult. It's oftentimes time consuming, so it delays the project, but the extra effort of getting things in place and documented properly in the long run helps drastically when there's disputes about said change orders and they're reconciling the contract. Change orders, you should definitely have a procedure in place as to how the change order needs to be addressed, the scope of work within the change order and why it's not included in the original scope of work, and the procedure for approving change orders. So if the change order requires signature, have that in there. If there's some sort of thing that you want, safety measure you want in place to make sure that change orders are legitimate and being approved, address that in the contract. How the cost of the change orders is going to be adjusted. So sometimes it's going to be a portion of the contract will be reduced because this change orders are going to replace a part of it, so there's not redundant work, etc. So how the cost of it's going to be configured and the procedure for determining that should also be as much as possible defined in the contract. It's not perfect. You can't define everything all the time in the contract, but you definitely want to have the procedures in place defined for change orders. Another thing is materials and specifications about materials. I remember a story about a contractor who did a whole fixed contract and didn't specify what materials are being used. The whole contract was bid for just everyday construction grade materials, and the customer wanted custom doors. So when it came time, they go, no, we want a custom door. We don't want the door that you just go systematically buy that you see in every house. Well, there wasn't a provision in the contract for that. And everything that they wanted all of the doorknobs, they wanted a custom kitchen, like all of this stuff that was custom, and the contractor had budgeted for and allocated for non-custom, but the contract didn't specify that. When you have a contract and you don't specify what's going to be used or who's going to supply what, then oftentimes it becomes a financial dispute between the contractor and the property owner. It might be that you take out some of the finish work and say that's to be determined later, or the cost, doors, that will be determined later, the cost of the hardware determined later, the cost of light fixtures. Otherwise, the contractor will bid it accounting for what is standard, not what the person wants as custom. And so that will create huge conflicts. So specify if this is what you're bidding, this is what you're bidding it on based on this. If you want something different, then it's going to be removed from the scope of work, or it's going to be defined in a different way. That avoids major disputes between the property owner and the contractor. And then one of the important things that needs to be defined is the termination clause. So what causes the contract to terminate, and what sort of events would lead to either party be able to terminate the contract and, you know, not continue on the project. Ideally, you want the contractor to go from start to finish, and you as a contractor want to go from start to finish, but not always do parties mesh as the project goes on. So you want to have a defined termination clause about what that's going to look like, and, you know, all the procedures for that and the ramifications of it. Specifically for huge projects, this is where you would have an attorney really go through it, who's experienced with construction, go through the contract, because they know systematically the things to look for. If it's not a huge project, you can have the, you know, funds to go hire an attorney. As best as you can, look at it and be as thorough as possible in your understanding of what's going to be expected from both sides. Before anyone signs, you're going to want to go through and review everything and, you know, make sure it accounts for it. Maybe go to the actual property and look at it and go, you know what, I didn't account for this. Let's see if that's included in this or it's not. Sometimes a scope of work will include something, but it's not in there. If that's something that's going to be included, but it's not necessarily in there, maybe it seems minor, maybe it doesn't, but you should include it in there. Because again, that often creates headaches for people, and then you have to like come back on the job, or it just creates a lot of frustration. As simple as things seem, the more you can define it and outline it, like the easier it is to adhere to it and keep progress going on a project. I've seen so many people have huge fights or lawsuits about something over like very undefined or very weak scopes of work that like seem so open-ended or so not open-ended that people really don't know. What seems like common sense, like that would be in there, can lead to a dispute later. Another thing is, you know, make sure you keep a file. So if you have something that involves plans, have a file with the plans in it, have a file with all of the you know, if you have, maybe you're like remodeling a kitchen, want the plans for it, the layout for it, the hardware that you want to use, the paint colors that you want to use, the materials you want to use, have a whole file on it, and keep that together along with the signed contract that both people should sign, and keep progress photos. Both sides should do that. The more you document it, the more you basically, both sides keep themselves accountable to the task. So at the outset for project management, when you go into it, the first and foremost thing is to make sure that your contract is well defined and that both sides understand what the contract says and what they're both going to be responsible for. And I see so many people not do that. And it seems very obvious, but for some reason, I'm not sure why, they just don't do it. If you like this video, you might also like my video on handling disputes, which I hope you didn't watch this video because there was a dispute, but I have a video on handling disputes. You might want to check that one out. You also might want to sign up for my newsletter, where every week I give some very helpful information and tips related to real estate. It comes out on Sunday. It's free. Costs you nothing. Brings, I'm sure, joy to your life if you had it. Otherwise, thanks for checking out this video, and I will see you in the next one.